Hi, I'm Paul Feinberg, and welcome to the UCLA Anderson podcast. I'm here today with Professor Emeritus Daniel J.V. Mitchell, and our topic today is wage price spirals, inflation, and current policies. Dan, you've written extensively on this topic, along with our Senior Associate Dean, Chris Erickson. Before we get too far into policy and current issues surrounding it, can you define for our audience what a wage price spiral is so that we're all on the same page with that?
A wage price spiral as a concept came about really in the 1950s, 60s, maybe into the 70s, and it was very much correlated with the growth of unions that occurred in the 30s and 40s and had a big impact on the way the economy functioned after World War II. And the notion was, to some extent, that unions would push up wages exogenously, and then prices would go up, and when prices went up, that would signal another round of union wage increases. And although even at that time the majority of workers were not unionized, it was thought that, at least in the private sector, employers would follow along with the union precedent because they didn't want their workers to be unionized, or they just felt they had to keep up for equity reasons or whatever. So that was part of the story. Part of the story was that if you had some exogenous shock, for example, of the type we've had today with gasoline prices rising, that would set in motion a process. It wouldn't be just a one-time event, but rather prices would go up and then unions would bargain for higher wages, and that would spill over into the non-union sector, and because wages were higher, that would raise prices again, and we get into a kind of an ongoing spiral rather than a one-shot event. And this was all going to be very difficult for macroeconomic policymakers, such as the people at the Federal Reserve, to manage.
Well, in 2008, and correct me if I'm wrong, unions are not the power in our economy that they once were. So how has the decline in union clout impacted wage price spirals, theoretical or realistically?
Well, in the private sector, unionization is now down to below 1/10 of the wage and salary workforce. So they really have become a marginal player in terms of overall wage determination and macroeconomic events. But there still seem to be some in policy-making circles that carry on this older thought that if you get a sudden shock like a boost in gasoline prices or energy prices, that will somehow carry into other prices and other wages, and a process will be set in motion, not a one-shot event, but an ongoing event. I don't think today that's a realistic description of the way the economy works or the labor market works. And I think if you make policy on that basis, you're likely to make the wrong policy. In the current period, for example, you have a choice. You can worry a lot about inflation because of the rising costs of energy, or you can worry about the real state of the economy, which is very soft. Unemployment is rising. All of those indicators are telling us that the economy is not doing very well. And that would suggest that you want to stimulate the economy. So you have a choice. You can restrain the economy for inflation, or you can stimulate it to deal with the real side of the economy. And if you pick the wrong one, you're likely to get the economy into trouble. And we think, Chris Erickson and I think, that focusing on inflation at this time would be the wrong thing to do.
Why do you think there's this holdover mentality going back to when unions had more clout?
Well, I think it's partly because the people who tend to find themselves in policy-making positions, like myself, go back in years, and they remember an economy that was different from the type that we have today. If you go back into time for example, during the Kennedy administration, the administration was so concerned with this wage price spiral issue that they imposed what were called the voluntary wage price guideposts. And wage setters were supposed to adhere to certain standards, and there were all kinds of rules. They were voluntary, but of course if the president suggests something, it isn't as voluntary as it might sound. In the Nixon administration, there we had what you might think of as a kind of conservative Republican taking over from Lyndon Johnson. Initially, they came in and said, we're not going to do that wage price guidepost kind of stuff, but when it came down to it, the Nixon administration imposed mandatory wage price controls. So they went much further than the Kennedy people did. When the Carter administration came in, they went back to the Kennedy-Johnson view of wage price guideposts. So you had this long history of economic policy geared around this concept, and people who grew up in that still tend to think in those terms.
You said earlier that inflation is not what you'd be focusing on right now. So the obvious question is, what would you be focusing on now?
Well, I'd be worrying about the real state of the economy. We can debate this issue of whether there is a recession or how you term the current situation, but the fact is the unemployment rate is rising. There are lots of indicators that suggest the economy is weak. We have various problems in financial markets, mortgage markets, other financial markets, and I would rather be concerned about those kinds of issues and not fretting about inflation.
Are there any specific recommendations you would make to a policymaker, and can you contrast those with, the mistake they might make if they were only focused on this wage price spiral idea?
Well, it's undoubtedly going to be the case that somewhere there'll be some union settlement, maybe here in Hollywood, but somewhere, and people will point to it and say, gee, they got more than we expected, or something like that. You can always find something like that somewhere in the economy. And then if you take this wage price spiral notion seriously, you start saying, well, it happened there, but somebody else is going to follow them, and then somebody else is going to follow them, and pretty soon we're going to have a major problem. Now, that may seem unrealistic to a lot of people, but we know that in fact, has occurred in the past. You may recall back in the late 1990s, there was a strike at United Parcel. Now, of course, everybody knows United Parcel, the trucks that run around, deliver packages, and so on. And there was a settlement there that was maybe a little out of line with what people expected. And you'll actually find people at the Federal Reserve making policy at that point, worrying about wage price spirals and so on. And yet this was, a settlement in one company, involved a relatively small proportion of the total workforce, and there's no indication after the fact that it had any impact other than on that particular employer.